see you here. This is our regular monthly meeting of the Humanists of West Suburban Chicagoland. We're a membership chapter of the American Humanist Association. And frankly, the reason why we're here in this church is this church has in its constitution that it's an affiliate of the American Humanist Association. So it's a good fit. You have to understand that back in the 30s, the Unitarian ministers in the denomination were active in formulating what we call humanism. They wrote the first manifesto, which has been revised or upgraded twice in 73 and 2003. But basically, we're a naturalistic philosophy kind of group. Some people are busy talking about whether gods exist or not. And we took care of that back in high school. Yeah. We're interested in how to live this life well. As a matter of fact, one of the primary goals of humanism is to help you and me and all of us to reach our full potential. Now, that's a task, because we've had all of these childhood experiences which have bent us one way or the other, straight or crooked, or both, and here we are now with the opportunity to become the people we choose to be. Hercules, some guy 2,600 years ago, was talking about the very same thing. He says, you become what you think. And if you want to develop your personality, think about those things that are consistent with your principles. So there's a job for us. We're going to be talking about nuclear stuff tonight, which is not going to be about you. But every day you have the opportunity to work on who you are becoming. And we congratulate you on the effort and invite you to join this group as we continue to try to be our best selves. This takes on a social action aspect. Since we're interested in becoming good people, we're social in our orientation, and this puts us in a situation to be concerned about the institutions that we have. And I do hope you all voted yesterday, because that makes a difference. And that really turns out to be quite a practice, quite a humanist practice, to be involved in a society and change the institutions to fit our needs and to go the way we think they should. Okay, well that's a little introductory stuff. We have you're welcome, and I made my little comment. And now we have some announcements we want to get out of the way. And where should we begin? Stephanie, you want to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The second Friday of every month is Just Views, and this Friday in this room at 7:20, we're going to be looking at the Mexican-American drug connection. There's a lot of violence going on, and heavy-duty drugs are being brought in for the black market, and this deserves our attention more than it's been getting lately because of some of the other big issues. So join us this Friday night for that, and we will have some interesting resources from the Hispanic Council of Chicago and Immigrant Solidarity of DuPage. The discussion following the film is always as interesting as the film itself. And then, as you all know, this is the second part of our three-part series on nuclear energy, the pros and cons. And the program following this is going to be a debate, a civil debate about that. And so we invite you to come on Sunday morning, May 3rd at 9:30 a.m. And that's part of our ongoing effort to serve the community as well as our own humanist group to discuss the critical issues of our time.
That's right in this room?
Right.
Scott? Yep.
So, welcome everyone. I would like to reiterate what Jack said about our humanist group. One of the things that appeals to me personally about humanism is the naturalistic philosophy part. I am a science buff. I have studied science formally and informally all of my life, and I continue to do so. One of the things that I do here at this church is provide a monthly program about modern science. This year we've got 2 programs left. In 2 Sundays, I'll be giving a talk about symmetry theories in modern physics. it's not, hopefully it's not as inaccessible or esoteric or scary as some of you might imagine. I think it's one of the most elegant and groundbreaking sets of principles to be applied in modern science, and not too many people have a familiarity with it, so we're going to be talking about that. And then in May, we're going to talk about cosmology and multiple universes during the Sunday morning science program that I facilitate. Those are in addition to the upcoming debate that Stephanie mentioned about nuclear power. If you were with us a couple of, let's see, I guess it was last Sunday, we had a discussion about nuclear weapons and how nuclear weapons were developed, what some of the history of the weapons themselves and the testing. And one of the things that we covered briefly then was the bombs to energy, bombs to electricity program. And we'll probably refer to some of that today as well. Feel free, if you're interested in our programs, if you find yourself resonant with our philosophy, to inquire about a membership. If you join our chapter, you get one of these wonderful t-shirts for free. Beth, I don't know if you brought any today. Yep. The t-shirt is free. She does have some. The t-shirt is free. The membership is about $25. So that's that, unless you have another announcement.
I just wanted to make a comment and then you get the introduction. We build a mailing list. That's how we can keep you informed of what we're doing. So if you're on my email list that I send out once a month, that's fine. Otherwise, I'd like to get your name and your email address. And a lot of you have already signed in, and so maybe I've got most of you. He's going to make the introduction.
There is a car out here with lights on.
There's still a car with lights on out in the parking lot? What is it, a gray?
Very focused, force focused.
Checking their
There's a couple other groups meeting at church, so.
I'll check with the group downstairs.
Great, so tonight we have the distinct honor of listening to Dr. David Grabaskas from Argonne National Laboratories. He's a nuclear engineer in the safety analysis section, specifically at Argonne. He's a graduate of Ohio State University with a bachelor's in mechanical engineering and a PhD in nuclear engineering with a focus on reactor safety and risk management. His research included advanced reactor accident analysis and future risk-based regulatory requirements. Since joining Argonne, his work has centered on the safety of advanced reactor designs, including techniques to analyze the reliability of new passive safety systems. He's been involved with the assessment of risk for offshore oil and gas platforms as part of a review following the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and also explores new risk assessment approaches for advanced reactors in preparation for future regulatory licensing to allow risk-based design option comparison. Dr. Grabaskas and I have been corresponding for a few months off and on, most recently this morning when he said that we could record this. This discussion will be available on YouTube, as are most of our other meetings, as well as the Science Sunday program that I facilitate. So there's a YouTube channel. If you do a search for HWSC, which is the initials of our group, Humanists of West Suburban Chicagoland. If you do a search on YouTube for HWSC, and perhaps put in the word science if it needs a little more of a filter, you will find eventually the channel for our programs. So we're going to record this. We welcome Dr. Dave Grabaskas. He does not have PowerPoints to share. He's going to just speak to us about what he knows about nuclear power safety, and we'll have a wide-ranging and free-ranging discussion, taking lots of audience questions and whatnot. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dave Grabaskas.
Can you guys hear me okay?
What?
Stand up on the platform. Stand up here instead. Well, first, thank you, Scott, and thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it, and I've been looking forward to this for a long time. This will be a lot of fun. And I want to start off by saying the opinions expressed herein are my own and do not represent Argonne National Lab, the Department of Energy, or the U.S. federal government. So now I'm free to say what I want on the clock. So first, so Scott talked a little bit about my background. I think it's fair to understand a little bit about these people's background before we listen to them. So, like Scott said, I went to Ohio State University, did my undergrad in mechanical engineering and my master's and PhD in nuclear engineering with a focus area on reactor safety and specifically risk analysis. And right after school, I joined Argonne National Lab, where my official title was nuclear engineer, but I really spent most of my time doing risk analysis, looking at advanced nuclear reactor designs, but also, like he mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work for the offshore oil and gas industry too, doing risk analysis following the big BP oil spill. The whole reorganization of the federal regulators, we've been helping them analyze the risks offshore also. So a little bit about myself. So I live in the south side of Naperville, not too far away from here, with my wife and my 7-month-old son. I consider myself a bit of an environmentalist, actually. I love the outdoors and hiking, growing my own food and composting in my backyard. I'm a big animal rights guy. I've been a vegetarian for about 7 years now because of that. Now, since I focus on risk analysis at work, I like to think that that gives me a bit of a technology-neutral, technology-agnostic approach to different things like nuclear power. And I try to be a little less evangelical than some other people who might be here talking about nuclear power. Because truthfully, what I do with my job is people present me with designs for different plants, whether it be a nuclear reactor, an offshore oil and gas platform. And I try to look at, well, what are the accidents that can happen? What are the consequences of those accidents? Do they meet whatever safety requirements we have? So I like to think I try not to fall in love with any technology because it will cloud my judgment trying to decide really the safety of the reactor. So I'll try to be fair here and go over the pros and cons of nuclear power. And what I really want to do is, just in my talk, I give PowerPoint presentations all day, every day at work and traveling around. So I didn't want to do that here because that's boring. So I really just wanted to get up and talk. I have some notes here because I just wanted to kind of establish a basic level of understanding here. But I really wanted to open it up pretty quickly here to questions. And when I'm talking, feel free to interrupt me with questions or anything like that too. So I have my notes here, but that's mostly just to keep me from going off on a tangent because I can easily go on one topic for the next 2 hours and nobody would really learn anything from that. So the way I've kind of structured the topics I want to go over, I want to start by just kind of addressing some of the I call them myths about nuclear power that I hear a lot when I'm out talking. And then from there, go a little bit into the history of nuclear power, where we're at now, where we might be going in the future. But then also why, even though I like to consider myself a pretty technology agnostic guy, I still think nuclear power is a pretty good thing. And why I like working in it and I like trying to expand nuclear power here. But I hope that my reasoning for that resonates with you guys and it's a little more accessible there. So first, just a quick background on nuclear energy. Here in the U.S., it provides about 20% of our electricity. We have about 100 operating power reactors at any given time here. We've been shut down a couple of the past few years, but we're also building a couple in the south too. In Illinois, it's a little different. We have 12 reactors, and it provides about 50% of our electricity for the state, so it's the most out of any state in the country. And actually, even here around Chicago, it's more about like 80% of our electricity is from nuclear power. There was, as I understand it properly, a pretty concerted effort back in the 70s to really power Chicago on nuclear energy in a way of avoiding air pollution and smog that a lot of the other big cities have. So Chicago is somewhat unique in that it's literally surrounded by 5 or 6 different nuclear power stations out here in the suburbs. Now globally, nuclear power provides about 17% of the world's electricity. Some countries are higher than others. France is probably the most notorious. Back in the 70s, France had a pretty concerted effort to become energy independent because they didn't have a lot of natural resources in their country. So they decided to go nuclear. So about 80% of France's electricity is produced by nuclear energy. The latest party that has come into power in France might not be so pro-nuclear, so what that future might look like in France, we're not so sure. So No, so those are some baseline statistics, and I'll mention various statistics throughout this talk. I'm not giving a source here, but anyone, if they want the source of what I'm saying, feel free to contact me afterwards. I'll be glad to provide something like that. So I want to run through a couple of myths that I run into a lot when I'm talking about nuclear power. And truthfully, I'm going to pick on The Simpsons a little bit here. As a young guy, I love The Simpsons. I think seasons 1 through 9 are probably my favorite television of all time. But somebody there does not understand how a nuclear reactor works, and I think a lot of the myths in society kind of indirectly come from that. So the first kind of myth I wanted to talk about is just the general picture of what a nuclear reactor is that people have in their mind. A lot of people, when I talk to them, they envision this giant room with lightning bolts flying around or something like that, where plasma and magic come together and somehow create nuclear energy out of that. But truthfully, the way I like to think of nuclear energy is that it's hot rocks boiling water, essentially, is what nuclear power is. So, essentially, we dig up uranium, we enrich it, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We stick it in fuel rods, which are about, say, the diameter of my finger. You put these fuel rods next to each other, and because of nuclear fission, they get hot. So you run water over it, you boil water, and power a turbine, and you create electricity. It's the same way we create electricity with coal or natural gas or any of those. The difference is instead of burning coal or natural gas to create the heat, we're creating heat through nuclear fission in these rods of hot rocks, essentially. Now, just basic level of understanding. So the nuclear fission is we have uranium atoms in there. A neutron hits it, it causes the uranium atom to split into two smaller atoms. And also there's a mass defect that we call that gets directly translated into energy, and that's what heats things up and creates nuclear power. So in your mind, don't imagine a big room of lightning bolts and plasma. It is literally rods of hot rocks and water that we run water or some other coolant over and boil water and power a turbine. It really is as simple as that. The actual plants itself are a little more complicated, but the theory behind it is that simple. Now, that kind of leads it a little bit into my second myth that I run into a lot, and that's our nuclear power plants here in this country cannot become a nuclear bomb. That's something I run into a lot, and you see this, the Simpsons who made this mistake where you go into a nuclear power plant, there's always a core destruct button where if you push it, there's a big mushroom cloud and you can just turn it into a nuclear bomb. Or what's the other movie I saw recently? Pacific Rim with the giant battling robots that are nuclear powered, where they have to turn one of these robots into a nuclear bomb, so they just pull some lever and suddenly now that reactor is now a bomb that can go up. That's not the case with our power reactors. The reason for that is because of uranium enrichment. So not to get too down into the weeds and technical details, but so uranium is just found in the ground. It's a mineral like any other. But almost all of the uranium in the ground is the isotope called uranium-238. It's the 238 referring to the mass. And uranium-238, which makes up over 99% of the uranium in the ground, it's not fissile, it's not a fuel for a nuclear reactor. But uranium-235 is another isotope. But it only makes up like 0.7% of the uranium in the ground. So it's really tough to take natural uranium and power a nuclear chain reaction. Now, this is actually the way Canada does it. They have a weird reactor design where they can use natural uranium. But here in the US, we enrich the uranium to get and by enrichment, I mean the level of U-235, which is the fuel compared to the U-238, which is the other uranium in the ground.
Is that why you hear the term centrifuges around nuclear?
That's it, exactly it. So when you want to enrich uranium, the easiest and probably most straightforward way is to put it into a centrifuge, where you spin it really fast, the heavier U-238 becomes separated from U-235. And so lately with the big Iran nuclear deal, you probably heard that we're limiting the number of centrifuges that they have. And that's what they're using their centrifuges for, to enrich uranium. Now, when you enrich it, you can put, once you get over 20% U-235, so natural uranium is like 0.7%, so less than a percent U-235. If you enrich it above 20%, that's considered weapons-grade uranium or highly enriched uranium. And actually, even though it's kind of a misleading term, because a real nuclear bomb would use much more highly enriched uranium than 20%. But that's the metric that gets tossed around. But our nuclear plants are the ones that generate power. The fuel in them is enriched below 5%. So no matter which way you got this uranium in the reactor, no matter which way you configured it, it couldn't become a bomb because it's not enriched to the level necessary to create a bomb. So that's a myth I run into all the time, that a terrorist can break into a plant and they could rearrange how the reactors operate and create a nuclear bomb that would wipe out miles and miles. And it's just, the physics aren't there for that to happen. The enrichment level is not high enough for that to happen. Now that's not to say, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Honestly, I'm not sure I heard the bomb part, but what I hear is the meltdown.
Yes.
That you could melt down through the bottom of the floor and into the ground and
Yeah.
groundwater. That's the danger I've heard more about.
Yeah, so meltdown, well, first, I can talk about this a little bit more at the end. So meltdown is kind of a generic term, that any time the fuel gets so hot that the fuel pins that these rocks are in starts to melt, essentially. And really what that means is that you haven't provided adequate cooling, you haven't put enough water on these things to keep them cool enough so that they don't melt.
Or you brought too many too close together.
You brought too many too close together. I mean, usually, you look at like Fukushima or 3 Mile Island, and what happened was they weren't able to provide sufficient water to keep these rods cool enough so that they got too hot and they began to melt down. The one complication there is that if they melt down in a certain configuration, it can become hard to cool them. So even if you got lots of water on them, later it can be hard to cool this kind of melted mass of uranium. That's where the so-called China syndrome comes into play, where, oh, you can't cool it, then it'll just keep melting forever right through the earth, which really isn't true. But that's the one possibility where that's where the China syndrome name came from. It would be some type of uncoolable mass that melt through. And I'll talk more about the accidents a little bit at the end, because that's really my bread and butter is risk analysis and accident analysis.
When you talk about a nuclear plant can't become a nuclear bomb.
Yeah.
That's true, but if you look at Fukushima and the way it blew up, they
Yeah.
can become what you would call a dirty bomb.
Yeah.
You have the dirty bomb idea of, terrorists gathering enough nuclear material and just blowing it up with a conventional weapon. So wherever it scatters to, usually a small area.
Yeah.
That would, but in the case of Fukushima, it's a pretty
Yeah.
big area and the atmosphere and ocean.
And that's what I was talking to Charlotte where he's at here a little bit before on this, that the dirty bomb, which I kind of see the analogy there. There was a hydrogen explosion at Fukushima, which I can talk more about later, that can scatter some radiation about. And kind of the dirty bomb threat of a terrorist getting some spent fuel or something, blowing it up and dispersing some radioactivity, that the real threat from that is kind of a psychological panic you can cause in society, where the dose that people would get is actually not huge. And the consequence on the health side is gigantic. It's more of the panic and mentality you can create from such an event. And that might be why it's appealing to a terrorist organization, because blowing up a tanker full of gas doesn't scare a lot of people, but blowing up a little radioactivity can scare a lot of people very easily. So actually that's a good segue into kind of the third point I wanted to talk about that involves radiation, but that the nuclear power plants pollute a lot in general. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen a report on the news about global warming, and the picture they show is of the cooling towers at a nuclear power plant. And you have the big billowing clouds coming out of the cooling towers. I see it constantly on the news. But yeah, as some of you said, the cooling towers, all that's coming out of there is steam. Nuclear power produces essentially no greenhouse gas emissions. It's kind of on the same level as wind if you look on the life cycle. It actually produces a little bit less than solar, because solar has some other unique pieces to it. But on operating on a whole, there's essentially no greenhouse gas. What you see coming out of the towers is just steam that's cooling water being used in the reactor. But then on the other side, there's the thought that living next to a nuclear plant also gives out a lot of radiation kind of pollution also. And I'll just say personally, I would have absolutely no qualms living right next to a nuclear power plant. I wouldn't be the least bit concerned when I analyze risk for nuclear power plants all day long. Actually, if I had my choice of a power plant to live next to, it would probably be nuclear, definitely rather than coal or natural gas. And I probably wouldn't enjoy the sound of the wind turbines going off or something like that next to me. So I'd have no trouble there. But I wanted to kind of go off on a little bit of a tangent and talk about radiation and dose. because it's a topic that gets mentioned a lot, but I don't think a lot of people really have a good understanding of the different radiation doses we're exposed to in just our normal lives. So the way we measure radiation dose is by a unit called REM, or before REM. And in our just in our day-to-day lives, we all get a dose from different things. Here around Chicago, in a usual year, we might get 0.3 to 0.4 REM of radiation dose. For us around here, the majority of that is from radon gas in the ground. For those of you who don't know, so there's natural uranium in the ground. It decays over time and produces radon gas. That radon gas comes up through the soil, and especially if you have a basement, the radon gas can come into your basement. The radon gas is slightly radioactive, so if you're in your basement a lot, breathing this air year after year, it can increase your chances of getting lung cancer. So I don't know, do any of you have a radon mitigation system in your house? I do too. The house we just bought 2 years ago, we had one, had them install it too. Essentially, the radon mitigation system, it just has a fan connected to a pipe below your slab, and it takes all the air below your house and chucks it out over the chimney, just to reduce what little dose you get in the basement. Yeah.
So, our house, it was mandatory that our house have one of those. The developer and the regulations in the town required a radon mitigation system, but it has no fan, so it's ridiculous. And maybe you can tell us why.
Well, ours does have a fan, actually. It runs 24 hours a day, every day. It actually causes negative pressure underneath the slab, so that way the gas goes out through this radon mitigation system rather than entering the basement. I don't know how your system, I actually don't know what gas.
It doesn't work because radon's heavier than nitrogen and oxygen.
Just makes you feel good.
Yeah.
I'm interested to see more about that. But just in general, especially around here, just because of the way the ground is, we get a lot of radon dose. Probably half the dose people get in their normal day-to-day lives. We get dose from cosmic radiation. That's actually very dependent on elevation. Say in Denver, they probably get twice the dose we get here, just because they're higher up and they have less atmosphere to protect them. Flight attendants, especially those who go transcontinental a lot, get a fair amount of dose because they're very high in the atmosphere day after day after day. So they'll get a bit of dose there too. There's a little bit of fallout still floating around from the 2,000 or so nuclear bomb tests we did back in the day, but that's pretty small. Dental x-rays and stuff like that might also contribute a little bit to your dose. What's actually probably the biggest dose a lot of people ever get in their lives, has anyone in here ever had a CT scan done? So a CT scan can actually deliver a fairly big dose in a very short amount of time. So say you get about 0.3 to 0.4 REM in an average year in your life. A CT scan can give you 1 to 5 REM in an hour, depending if you have a whole body CT scan or something like that done. So truthfully, that's probably, if those of you had it done, that's probably the biggest dose you'll ever get in your life is from the CT scan.
Yeah, when you're speaking of, you're probably going to move into speaking about the safety levels of getting certain levels of REM. Is that a per year thing, or is that like that scale starts when you're born and it keeps filling up throughout the entirety of your life?
So the way it works, the shorter time period you get a dose, the worse it is, essentially like that. So say a radiation worker at a nuclear power plant, so people who deal with radioactive stuff on a day-to-day basis, the limit is 5 REM in a year they're allowed to get. So when you compare that to a CT scan, which can give you 1 to 5 REM in an hour, that's a pretty good dose over a short amount of time. But again, it's probably not being dangerous or anything like that. So just for comparison, 500 REM in a very short amount of time is usually what we call the LD50 dose, where 50% of the people would die pretty quickly if they got that dose. So that's 500 REM, a CT scan, 5 REM, your yearly, what you get just from background, like a 0.5 REM. So there's many orders of magnitude in there, so I don't want to scare anybody. And actually, there are people who believe that a low-level radiation is actually kind of good for you. People have argued, well, why are cancer rates in Denver lower than cancer rates here if they're getting 2 or 3 times the radiation dose here? There's a million different things that cause cancer, so I'm not sure if I really believe that. But there's also there's a famous beach down in Brazil, I believe it is, that's a fairly radioactive beach just because of the contents of the soil. And people love going there and burying themselves in the sand because it's supposedly a holistic treatment to treat various illnesses. But really, just getting a little bigger dose than they would normally get. And there's I think a city in Iran that's, because their soil, they get a fairly big dose that people have tried to say, correlate that to cancer or something like that. Yeah.
Coming back to your radon extraction in the basement, why do you bother? It must be very low level. Why do you bother?
It is very low. Actually, so the real reason we did it, so it's, the EPA sets a guideline of 4 picocuries per liter of air, which curies is just another measure of radiation, where if you're above 4 picocuries per liter of air, you're supposed to take some action or something like that. And when we bought our house, it was a little bit above that, so we asked the sellers to put in the radon mitigation system. Mostly because then if we sell a house, we don't want the people we're selling it to say, hey, your level's too high, pay the money to put in a mitigation system because it costs like $1,500 or something like that. So I know I'm not particularly concerned about it. Actually, we have all of our workout equipment down in the basement, so I'm down there all the time breathing it, and it was not a huge concern to me. But since sellers are paying for it now, I don't have to worry about it when I sell it. We decided to go through with it. I think I took our radon levels from 4.6 picocuries per liter of air down to like 0.2 picocuries per liter of air, which is the same as just standing outside on the soil, essentially. The open air where wind can blow radon gas away. Is there anything else? Other sources of radioactivity in your life. Your smoke detectors give off a little bit of radiation. That's actually how they detect smoke. They have a little radioactive source in there. Bananas, anything that has potassium, there's a radioactive isotope of potassium that you eat. Actually, bananas are probably one of the most radioactive foods that we eat. The same with orange juice and other potassium type thing. Table salt will have a little bit too. So I'm not sure if I'm a big believer in this low-level radiation. It's good for you, but we're exposed to it all the time. Yes?
Are you saying the radiation from bananas is the same as plutonium that's good in gas?
So actually, there's 3 different kinds of radiation: alpha, beta, gamma. And what really matters is, so if it's an alpha particle, what's the energy of that alpha particle? It's beta, the energy of beta, gamma, energy of beta, gamma. And whether a gamma of a certain energy comes from plutonium or a gamma of a certain energy comes from potassium or something, the source doesn't matter. It's that particle and the energy of that particle that matters. There's the 3 kinds of radiation we worry about: alpha, beta, gamma. Alpha particles can essentially be they're really big particles, so you can stop them with a piece of paper. Beta particles are a little bit harder to stop. That might be like a piece of wood would stop a beta particle, no problem. Gamma, especially high energy gammas, are usually what the things you see people worry about where they put lead blocks, because high energy gammas can shoot through a couple feet of lead, before they get attenuated. So it depends on what the source and what that charged particle is that's going on.
I was just going to say, my understanding is that with bananas, the radioactive material that you might ingest, that our bodies have adapted to that, it exists in a kind of a homeostasis kind of situation, and then your body excretes whatever it doesn't need. And that really, a good analogy I heard with radiation is that if you had a fire and you're warming your hands at a fire, that's kind of like what you might think of as like an X-ray, okay? Where people are getting heat that's going through you. But if you take out a hot ember and you ingest it and it sits in your body and is damaged, that's more of a comparison of what people would be concerned about in relation to being exposed to something from a nuclear accident or radiation. That's the kind of radiation that people are concerned about, is ingesting plutonium or strontium.
Yeah.
It's not, this kind of,
I'm not sure if I fully agree with the analogy. So, the reason radiation is bad is because, you have a charged particle go through a cell in your body. It could hit the DNA, hurt the DNA, and then you potentially cause cancer if that DNA doesn't repair itself the right way. So, I don't know, to say your body is adapted to that, your body does repair DNA all the time.
Well, it's adapted to the banana.
Yeah, but what your body is really seeing is that charged particle, but the source of that charged particle is, it doesn't realize that. So I see the analogy, but I have my disagreements with it. Sure.
I had a question about nuclear waste, which I understand. Are you planning to address that?
Yeah, so actually that is the next topic on my list, so thank you for the segue. And that, so I call it a myth here, but a strong asterisk with it, the myth of nuclear waste. Now, I don't want to say waste is a myth. We create lots of what's called nuclear waste with our reactors. So first of all, nuclear waste is not, the big green buckets of goo you see on TV. That's not the nuclear waste that's produced at our nuclear power plants. But what happens is, so you have uranium in a fuel rod, you put it in the reactor. After about 3 years or so, you'll take these fuel rods out of the reactor. Now, we've really only used about 1% of the available energy in these fuel assemblies. Because of the fuel cycle that we're kind of operating on here in the U.S., after those 3 years, we take them out, we put them in a centrifugal pool to cool down because we have residual heat for a while. And then after that, right now, we're just putting them in big casks on site. We're not doing anything with them.
Why?
So let me.
Why waste it?
I'll go. It involves a little bit of background. So I'll say in the U.S. here we're on what's called an open fuel cycle, but there's other options. There's a closed fuel cycle. What I mean by an open fuel cycle is that we dig up uranium from the ground, we enrich it a little bit, we put it into a reactor, we use some of the energy, and then we take it out, and that's it. We don't do anything with it anymore. In a closed fuel cycle, you dig up uranium, you enrich it a little bit, you put it in a reactor, you take out that assembly, you reprocess it, you put it in another type of reactor, like a fast reactor or a breeder reactor, which I'll talk about a little bit. You make more fuel, you reprocess it, put it back in the water reactor, use it, reprocess it, put it back in the breeder, create new fuel, and this essentially goes to infinity. You just keep creating fuel this way. So why don't we do that in the U.S.? And I'll explain the positives of doing that in a second. So you really have to go way back to the very origins of nuclear power. The first ever power reactor built was called the Experimental Breeder Reactor 1, EBR-1. Argonne helped build it. It's out in Idaho. So this just powered 4 light bulbs and then powered the building. It was the first ever peaceful use of nuclear energy to create electricity. And by the name, it was Experimental Breeder Reactor. And what they wanted to show with this reactor is that by breeding, and what I mean by that is you put uranium into the reactor, but by a certain configuration and using the right type of neutrons, you can create plutonium, and you can use plutonium in a reactor later. So you can create more fuel than you're using in the reactor. So that's why they call it breeding. And that's where you can kind of get this infinite process out of it. So they built EBR-1 and it was successful. So Admiral Rickover of the Navy said, well, these nuclear reactors would be great on our submarines, on our Navy submarines, because back then they ran on diesel power, which meant every once in a while you had to surface and get air for the diesel engines. And you were susceptible to the enemy while you were getting air. So Admiral Rickover said, well, if we ran on nuclear power, submarines could stay submerged for months on end, essentially. It would give us a huge advantage. So he said, okay, well, we'll build a submarine with one of these, with a reactor like EBR-1. But EBR-1 used a sodium coolant rather than water. It's a little different than our power reactors now. But some people were suggesting a water reactor. So he said, okay, well, build me one submarine using a sodium reactor and build me one submarine using a water reactor, and we'll see how they perform. And this is the USS Nautilus and USS Seawolf, built in the mid-50s. Both of the submarines performed very well, but with the sodium reactor, there was a bit of material compatibility issues with the sodium and the heat exchanger, because liquid sodium can be tough to contain at high temperatures in a heat exchanger. So Admiral Rickover said, you know what, we'll just go with the water reactor design for our submarines, because it's just easier. We're in water, it is water, so that's that. So there was a lot of government money poured into water reactors, and we call them light water reactors, but that's beyond the scope here. And people were trained on how to operate water reactors and so on. So then in the later 50s, when they wanted to start commercializing nuclear power for electricity production, not just for defense uses, they said, hey, we have all this research and development and operators who know how to use water reactors, so we'll build water reactors as some of our first ones. And the water reactors were just this first part of the fuel cycle. Dig up uranium, put it in the reactor, and then you have something done. And later on, you can reprocess it in a different type of reactor. So the plan was still at some point to go to this closed cycle. We would build these fast breeder reactors, and then we would use this waste that we're creating. So we built a couple of test breeder reactors, another like EBR-2, an experimental breeder reactor 2, Fermi 1 outside Detroit. But a little bit of politics got involved. In the 70s, specifically 1977, President Carter put a ban on reprocessing in the United States. The reason he did that was his concern, which I don't want to get too political, but I believe it was a little misguided, was reprocessing. So you put in uranium and you created plutonium in the reactor and you could reprocess. Well, in reprocessing, you could technically extract that plutonium and then use it to build bombs instead of using it to make fuel in a reactor. So he said, this is too much of a danger for our non-proliferation. Other countries could get this technology and start making bombs, so let's not do it. Now, that's a questionable decision for various aspects. First, here in the U.S., we have enough plutonium to last us forever, so who cares if we're reprocessing stuff here? And second, well, look what's happened anyway. Plenty of other countries have gotten nuclear technology, even without us reprocessing. So it's, I don't know if it was worth the price we paid to go down that route. So that really put a halt to this closed fuel cycle back in 1977, and we've really struggled to get back on it ever since. Part of that is because reprocessing, so recycling fuel means you have to build a reprocessing facility to chop up the fuel and put it into this other reactor. You have to build these fast breeder reactors to put the fuel in to breed, and then you'll get this cycle. But it's fairly expensive, where just digging uranium up from the ground and enriching it and putting it in the reactor is fairly cheap. So there's not a whole lot of motivation from the utility standpoint to go down this breeder reactor route, because they just dig it up, put it in the reactor, and then we'll stick it in our pool on site, and that will be that. And actually what happened, this is a whole other story here, is technically the spent fuel that the nuclear reactors have produced belongs not to the utilities, but belongs to the federal government. It's the federal government's responsibility to do something with it. And that was a way of encouraging utilities to build nuclear reactors rather than coal or something else, because the U.S. government said, well, at some point we'll go to this closed fuel cycle, we'll reprocess it, so we'll own it and we'll deal with that in the future. Well, it never manifested, so now the government owns the fuel and they have nothing to do with it.
Yeah, what I'm trying to get at here is, so you take the rods out at a certain point, but obviously if you didn't take the rods out, you still get efficiency from those rods. You can still heat water to some degree. I guess where I'm going with that is, if you didn't take those rods out, the waste material wouldn't be as radioactive because you're using up more of the uranium that's in there.
Yes and no. So yes, you could keep producing energy with it. The reason the utilities don't keep it in there longer is because their efficiency would start to drop. And, they have some target efficiency of the plant they want to maintain. Now the thing this is a big point with reprocessing that I forgot to mention, so I'm glad you mentioned it. When you put fuel in that water reactor the first time and it comes out, that spent fuel takes tens of thousands of years for the radioactivity to decay back to natural uranium levels, which is what we use as our benchmark, because there's natural uranium in the ground. The reason for that is because of the plutonium and what we call the transuranics in it. If you were to reprocess, that fast reactor uses the plutonium and transuranics. So the waste from there would only take about 300 years to return back to natural background levels of natural uranium ore. So, I mean, the big concern with Yucca Mountain, which is where people were planning on sticking their fuel, was that, it's going to be radioactive for tens of thousands of years. And people were scared of that, where if you were reprocessing, that the radioactive timeline decreases to a much, still 300 years, but as humans, we can plan 300 years much better than tens of thousands of years. So that was another big downside of not going this reprocessing route, is now we have spent fuel that's hotly radioactive for our foreseeable future as a human race, rather than just the next century or so. So actually, yeah, you could leave it in the reactor, the efficiency dies down, and what's really radioactive is this plutonium and transuranics, not the uranium fuel. So that is the political side. Has always, nuclear energy and politics has been intertwined since it was born. It's much more intertwined than any other probably energy source out there, just because of how it was formed.
Well, I understand that the government experimented pretty extensively with using some nuclear waste to harden weapons tips and barriers or shields, and that they powdered or disintegrated, and that was inhaled or infected many people, our own troops as well as civilian on the enemy side and so forth.
Yeah, and that's been a big question, not only for the defense but the nuclear industry too, and that's depleted uranium. So when you enrich uranium, remember I said that most of the uranium in the ground is U-238, but what we really want is U-235. That's what creates our reaction. Depleted uranium is that U-238 that we didn't use. So it's very similar to the uranium in the ground, and you might have higher concentrations of these other little isotopes that are in the ground too. But essentially, we pulled out the uranium-235 to use it in nuclear. So it's very similar to the uranium in the ground. But as you mentioned, especially in the Gulf War and the Gulf War syndrome, whether that's somehow caused by depleted uranium, and as a nuclear engineer, you're thinking, well, this doesn't make sense because that's very similar to the uranium in the ground, and that's not a huge health hazard. So I don't have a good answer for that, and I'm not sure if one exists out there, whether there's some other biological hazard or because it's mixed with something else in tank shells or something like that that's causing this. But I don't believe it's a radioactive thing because it's depleted uranium isn't highly radioactive. I mean, like the uranium in the ground, that's not highly radioactive. So, but yeah, I agree. There appears to be some connection there, but what it is, I don't know.
Yeah, the birth defects and other health problems are well documented. Maybe the precise etiology or whatever, how it's caused isn't specified.
Yeah, and I think that's, a lot of people say, well, it's depleted uranium, so there must be a radiation link in there. But truthfully, at least that's from my understanding, I don't understand that possibly. But there are other possible biological hazards. I'm not an expert in that.
So the great spent fuel rods.
Sure.
The main radioactivity in there is the plutonium transuranics, right?
Correct. The long-lived stuff.
Yeah, it cannot be relatively easily separated from the uranium.
So that brings up a good question. Yeah, you could separate the plutonium and transuranics out. The thing is, we actually don't want to because we don't want to separate plutonium because then, if somebody broke in and stole your plutonium, it would be bad and they could use it to make a bomb. Actually, Argonne does a lot of work in finding ways to reprocess where you don't just take out plutonium. You take it out with other stuff that's nasty and radioactive, so that way people can't steal it. So actually, we're very good at separating out the plutonium through reprocessing, but we don't want to do it for these political and non-proliferation reasons. So it's not a technical issue; it's a political non-proliferation issue. But yeah, you're right. We can separate it out, but politically, we don't want to.
Yeah. When you say we, who is we?
We as the...
Because there's a lot of countries, and a lot of countries have reactors.
Yes.
And if we decide not to do it, or some other country decides to, they're going to go ahead and do it.
Yeah, and actually, so France does do reprocessing because they're so highly nuclear. Although they've had repeated issues getting closing this fuel cycle with a fast breeder reactor. They've had political issues where these fast breeder reactors have been too expensive and politically unpopular. They were building one back in the 80s, and Carlos the Jackal shot some RPGs at it while we were building it in France too. So it's always been a hot topic issue in France, and they've never really been able to get this process working as smoothly as they thought they could, mostly because of cost and political issues rather than technical issues.
Is what I understood about plutonium being dangerous the fact that it is much more stable than a lot of the other radioactive elements, and you could just stick it in a suitcase and carry it around and not die instantly?
Potentially, depending on the exact configuration.
More portable than other.
Yeah, and the other thing is plutonium makes a nicer bomb than uranium does. So that's why.
Nicer bomb.
In terms of yield and things like that. So that's why the first bombs the U.S. made were uranium bombs, but they were quickly started replaced with plutonium bombs. And there's essentially no natural plutonium on Earth. You have to create plutonium.
Isn't it highly poisonous as a chemical?
It can be, and when it is radioactive, it has some really long-lived decay products too, which is part of the reason it's nasty. Yes.
Yeah, one of the things I read about Fukushima is the ongoing danger is the spent fuel rods are in an elevated pool, and there's a structural problem.
Yeah.
If that was to collapse, they would not be cooled anymore. That they still have to be kept cool in water, and that could cause a real problem with some explosions and scattering. And that leaves this thing, we've got this nuclear waste all over the place, and that isn't particularly safe just by itself, just sitting in pools either.
Yeah, and now specifically the plants at Fukushima are a weird type of plant design where the spent fuel pool is above the reactor, which is, there's a couple of those reactors in the U.S., but most of them the spent fuel pool is in a separate building from the reactor, so you don't quite have the weird structural issues you have there. But yeah, if if you completely lost cooling to the spent fuel pool, the rods still put off heat for a while after you've taken them out of the reactor. And if you lost cooling at some point, they could overheat and melt, and you could potentially get a release. The thing is it's not an energetic release like a bomb throwing material everywhere. Yes, it'd be radioactive, but it's not that dispersed into the atmosphere type radioactivity. And actually, that was a big concern at Fukushima, was making sure those spent fuel pools were cool because they were structurally
The
compromised.
hydrogen explosions caused the.
Yeah, and it's just weird that the hydrogen explosion happens right next to where the spent fuel pool was because of the reactor design.
But it could leave radiation over a big area and also make a bigger area that's.
Yeah,
I mean,
would
maybe
say-
that part of it, or it's not so much the explosion, but.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'd say over a big area because it'd be hard for it to transport radioactive material because it would just be sitting there, essentially. Usually you need something energetic to get material, to warm it up and get it into the air, disperse it over a large period, like what happened in Chernobyl, which I can talk about later. Chernobyl is a reactor design that we do not have here in the U.S. Bad reactor design. That's why it was a bad scenario there. But, let me see if I have anything else to talk about waste. Oh, one last thing, we talked about, the utilities have not gone down this reprocessing cycle. One of the reasons, is uranium's cheap to just dig up and create new fuel. The other reason is because we just don't create a huge amount of radioactive waste. So for someone in this room, if you took your electricity use in a whole year and it was provided by nothing but nuclear power, you'd create about 40 grams of spent nuclear fuel. So about a tenth of a pound if you powered your whole year on just nuclear power. So I mean, it's tiny, but now we've had 100 reactors operating for 40 years, so yeah, it does start to build up after a while, but I still want to put some perspective in it. I'm not talking mountains full of waste, it's not that level, but yeah.
But in Illinois, we have, from what I understand, the most nuclear waste of any state in the nation from nuclear power.
Yeah, because we have the most reactors, yeah.
And we're storing stuff at the Morris facility because they were thinking about reprocessing. They started shipping waste here and then they never did it, so we're just kind of holding that waste here.
Yeah.
And so we have a lot of nuclear waste in this state.
We do.
And if the spent fuel pools were targeted by terrorists, because they don't take it all out, they could leave it in there and then take it out and put it in casks right away, but it's costly, they don't want to. So they kind of have overstacked those spent fuel pools more than they're really designed.
And that's why they've started going to on-site casks, because the spent fuel pool was only designed to last a couple of years until the U.S. government then take this fuel and do something with it. So they weren't designed to house the whole lifetime of the plant's fuel.
They do have lots of waste.
They do.
Well, it's not 5 years worth of waste, it's 20 years worth of waste.
The life cycle.
And then maybe that last 30 years, they put it in dry casks.
Yeah, that's, once the spent fuel pool was filling up, they said, well, we'll put these dry casks on site and we'll start.
And those buildings aren't reinforced, like you have in Quebec with multiple layers.
Yeah, I mean, they are fairly hardened. I mean, they're good feats of, concrete and steel, but yeah, I agree.
Airplane.
Yeah, well, that's debatable. They do test it in aircraft impacts and stuff like that. But yeah, I understand your point. I think for us, especially nuclear engineers who work in nuclear power, the indecision about what to do with spent nuclear fuel has been a very frustrating issue for us. Because I mean, there are solutions out there. There's the reprocessing cycle, or there's the alternative of, well, we just put it in Yucca Mountain until we figure out what we want to do with it in the future. At least it's somewhere where it's buried, and it relieves this terrorism threat. Now, of course, Yucca Mountain's not going anywhere. Although that could potentially change with Harry Reid retiring this year. He's really been the holdup on Yucca Mountain, but Yucca Mountain's essentially dead at the political level recently.
When you say reprocessing the fuel, you reduced from 100,000 years to maybe a couple of centuries.
Yeah.
So it's not only a chemical process to separate the ingredient, but also a nuclear reactions process.
So you take that plutonium and transuranics that's in the spent fuel right now, and that becomes the fuel for this other type of reactor, and it will burn up this plutonium and transuranics as it's running, and then you have less of it when it comes out. So that's what brings that timeline down, and it also brings the volume down a lot too of the actual waste. because you're not, the spent fuel pin at the end of its time in the water reactor, it's still mostly uranium, which isn't really radioactive or anything, so you can use that uranium again in the process. So there's no point just burying all that uranium when it could be used for something in the future, or at least if we want to bury it temporarily.
Would you just explain to the crowd how you don't violate the laws of physics with a breeder reactor?
That's
Getting something for nothing.
That's a good one.
You said infinite, I'm thinking. Oh my
Yeah, that might be a little too rosy of a picture, but
yeah, it was.
yeah. But the thing, I have to break out a chart of the nuclides to really go through it. But essentially, you've dug up uranium. As that uranium was irradiated, it became plutonium. You're using that plutonium in a reactor that creates that. Using that plutonium and other uranium creates more plutonium. That plutonium can be used as fuel in that original reactor because now the isotopes are a little different. And that reactor can create more of that original plutonium, and it's a process where you're going between different isotopes. But the amount of material that you would need to start with to power reactors for hundreds of years is tiny if you used it in this efficient process. I mean, right now we dig up all this uranium and we use about like 1% of the energy, so we have to dig up a lot of uranium to do this. Where we're processing, even if you got like 90% of the amount of useful energy out of it. You know, now you're talking many hundreds of years just from the amount of.
But there is an energy loss in the process.
There is
It's got to be.
At some point, you gotta add something.
Yeah, at some point you add more natural uranium that you can convert into.
It is Maxwell's demon. I mean, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. And E equals MC squared. Yeah.
And when you use 35 fissions, it doesn't create just plutonium, it doesn't create
No, it
some
creates
38 also?
And so when you 235 fissions, it will go down into two atoms which are roughly half the mass of a 235, so we call it fission products. And those fission products tend to decay into even smaller things.
So that's waste that you can't use in the future.
It is waste, but it's a tiny fraction.
Right,
of
but that's all I'm saying, you got waste coming out, so you gotta add a little to top.
Yeah, and that waste is the 300-year decay waste. Well, let me see if I got anything else to say along here. Okay, let me skip quickly to some of the challenges I see with nuclear power. So I want to talk about some of the challenges, and then some of the pros I see with nuclear energy and why I still see it as a positive. And then I'll open it up for discussions with everybody.
So one last question.
Sure.
Maybe I didn't get it. So can you address again the long-term storage aspects of nuclear waste? You're saying some of it is being used for new generation reactors that we would reduce the radioactivity from 10,000 years to become to a natural level to 300 years. This is a priority of the U.S. government to do that? And if not, where do you do the long-term storage of nuclear waste? So you are talking about at least 300 years, and there was recently an incident last year in one of the plants, long-term storage salt mines.
Oh, yeah. The
barrel burst. So, I mean, how can you, if you have in your plan, if you have any long-term storage aspects of a few hundred years, you can't even handle a few years within a lifetime of a human being without there being no accident. So how can you seriously consider long-term storage?
So the accident last year you talked about was at the waste isolation pilot plant down in Texas. That is not a high-level waste facility like Yucca Mountain would be. The type of containers and stuff that waste was in, not you put spent fuel in, and that's a I can't remember if that's a Department of Energy, Department of Defense waste site.
It's a DOE, but it's defense waste.
Yeah, so it's a.
So it was not an end storage.
Well, it was an end storage, but for a different type of way. I don't know if you know.
It's rags and chemicals.
So what happened? Can you just explain us what actually happened? And why
what it sounded like was so the stuff that goes into that site is more just like in barrels, just, in your typical 55-gallon drum barrel. And apparently, while they were moving some, either a puncture or something developed in these barrels, and you had some radioactive release. From what I understood, it wasn't any dangerous level even to the staff there, but that they monitor this very closely, and anything out of the normal, immediately shut down the site.
But aquifers would be contaminated while they couldn't let.
Well, so this isn't a salt. What are they?
Permian salt basin, it's
No,
100 million years it's been there.
Yeah, so they
So-
picked this site because it's a giant salt basin, so water contamination is zero, because it could penetrate the
Wouldn't
soil.
have
Yeah, and that's why they picked this location. Yucca Mountain is not like that. It's a different type of geological repository, but the containers that the spent fuel would go into in Yucca Mountain is a much different type, much more hardened. And I'm pretty confident in our engineering abilities to be able to secure something like that for 300 years. And it's also much less if you're going on this reprocessing route too. Yes.
I have a different understanding of what happened there.
Sure.
Is that they have these barrels of this waste from Department of Energy waste. So it's Department of Defense waste, but it's not from nuclear power. So it's coming from like Los Alamos or something like that. And that they would put a material in it. They call it kitty litter. I don't know if it's really kitty litter, or kitty litter-like product. It had a clay base to it. And it would absorb some of the liquid that was in the containers. And that they switched that kitty litter product with a more organic type product without checking back with everyone else that would be okay. They put the organic product in the barrels and it reacted. And so when they stored the barrels, it created a gas in there. And basically, it's not an explosion, but the lid blew off. Like if you had, something growing in a jar in your house and the lid popped off. So that created this kind of explosion that they don't call an explosion, but it's a release of radioactive material. And it was very significant because that facility is supposed to last for 100,000 years, and they've only been operating 15 years. They had to shut the whole site down. There were 11 workers who were exposed to radiation. So it's pretty serious, and they're still shut down. They had waste sitting in the parking lot, being ready to store down into the facility. They didn't know what to do with it. They couldn't ship it back. They ended up shipping it to a temporary site in Texas. So, our one big experiment to store this kind of lower level nuclear waste has turned into a disaster, really, with all these experts and scientists in the whole laboratory. It comes down to a very simple human error of people not checking out what they're doing. That's the sum of it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Disaster is the right terminology, but at least a boondoggle from a government perspective on how I handle these things. I'll answer more questions in a second. I just want to run through the rest of my talking point, and I'll open it up and take whatever questions people have. So I wanted to quickly talk about some of the challenges to nuclear energy right now in the country, and then talk about kind of the risk analysis I do on a day-to-day basis. So challenges, so why are we building a ton of new plants here in the U.S.? We're building a couple new ones down south, but 10 or 15 years ago, it looked like we were going to be building 20 or 30, maybe even more new reactors here in the U.S. And the real thing that stopped that has been cost. If you look back like 2004, 2005, natural gas was $12, $13 a cubic foot, so nuclear was a pretty good option. When natural gas collapsed down to $2, $3 a cubic foot, utilities abandoned plans to build new nuclear plants. And natural gas plants are so quick and easy to build. You can turn them on and off, no problem. Unlike a nuclear plant, you don't want to be constantly throttling the plant or something like that. So what you've seen is an explosion of natural gas plants instead.
It doesn't mean explosion.
So to speak.
Wrong kind of explosion. Yeah, the licensing process for new nuclear reactors, there's a big regulatory burden. It's a long process. I mean, it can easily take a decade for a new reactor to go through the licensing process. And then if you want to do a new advanced reactor design, kind of say like a breeder reactor or something like that, I mean, it's even longer. It's a big process, very expensive to go through. So as just building a nuclear plant in general is a huge upfront investment, but less of an investment once the plant's up and operating, because you're not paying for constant fuel like you are with coal or natural gas. But the upfront investment is huge. It's billions of dollars to build this plant and go through the licensing process. So it's a tough sell to a lot of utility agencies to put in this big upfront investment that's going to take 30, 40 years for them to really turn the profit on, especially when you can build a natural gas plant like that. It's known technology, cheap and easy to do. Let's see. The other one is, as we talked about, the waste. Having no national real policy about what to do with the waste. It's funny, so the utilities have been paying the federal government for years into this waste policy fund, because the government was going to, all the utilities that use nuclear power were going to pay into this fund. The government was going to take this money and either reprocess the fuel or make it out or something like that. There's something like $10 or $20 billion in this fund. It's a massive fund. And the deadline for the government to do something was the beginning of the 21st century. Well, and they didn't. So all the utilities sued the government, so now the government is having to pay the utilities back for breach of contract for not living up to their contractual obligation of doing something with this fuel. So, I mean, there's so many billions of dollars in this fund, there's just no national policy at the government level how to proceed from here. Earlier in the 2000s, it looked like Yucca Mountain was more of a possibility, but that was, as political ties changed, that changed on the wayside. And there were other, not only was it Harry Reid in Nevada, but there were also countries that were along the route of transporting nuclear waste, which I don't see as a huge threat. The containers carrying the waste themselves, even in an accident scenario, are pretty sealed. There's not a huge release of, I think a tanker truck of gas would be a much worse accident than one of these things crashing. But states politically, that's a hot button issue, and you don't want waste traveling through your state too. So that was another one of the issues that got them. Now, I will say, I don't consider the safety of the plants an issue. So that's what I want to really talk about. Because I mean, this is what I do all day, is analyze risk. So at a fundamental level, when I talk about risk, I have a very specific definition of risk. Risk is the probability of an event happening times the consequence of that event. And you put whatever units you want to it all. Say the risk of getting in a car accident is okay, deaths per mile driven or something like that. And so, we all kind of intuitively analyze risk in our day-to-day lives. I mean, it was a risk for everybody to drive here. Driving's a relatively risky activity compared to a lot of the things we do, but we accepted that risk and we all drove here tonight to do this. Now, similarly, every electricity source we have also carries risks and benefits with it. Sometimes those risks are more hidden, sometimes they're very apparent what those risks are. Take, for instance, for coal, the risks from coal are very apparent. The pollution, we estimate, kills tens of thousands of people a year from burning coal in large quantities, especially in China, where they're burning it like crazy. But I mean, even with coal, there was a time when people accepted the risks because of the benefits of electricity. Right now, China's accepting the risks of burning huge amounts of coal because they want their electricity more. And I mean, there were times when we didn't fully understand all the risks that went along with that too. So I think when I try to look at any energy source, I keep that in mind, the benefits versus the risks. And what I want to say is in general, what we've seen is that for any society or country, however you want to break this down, the standard of living is very much tied to the ability and the accessibility of cheap, affordable electricity. And I don't mean that just for powering gadgets and nice things like that, but for the important things, for refrigeration. I mean, a society with refrigeration, like the standard of living shoots up. Industrial applications require huge amounts of electricity. Little things like air conditioning. I mean, back in the 1930s in Chicago, there's a huge heat wave that killed thousands of people in Chicago. And then if you look in '95, there was the big heat wave that I think was worse than the 1930s. But you had hundreds die rather than thousands, and almost all of them were in poor neighborhoods where they couldn't afford AC or something like that. And little things like that make huge differences in the standard of living. And I think what we see as a planet is that the demand for electricity is going to grow almost exponentially over the next century or so. Countries like India and China just cannot build power plants fast enough to keep up with their demand. I think I heard the statistic thrown around where in China, they could build a coal plant every week and it wouldn't meet their new demand for energy. Now, people say, well, really what we want to do is conserve, or find ways to reduce our energy use and things like that, which this is good to a point, but I don't want to tell some kid over in China right now, hey, we've enjoyed abundant electricity over here in the U.S. for decades, and it's great, but I'm sorry, we have to conserve so you don't get that. You don't get the electricity that we have here. Sorry. I really want I want the world to have cheap, plentiful, clean electricity. I think that's the best for us as a society and to advance as humans on this planet. Now the problem is we only have so many ways that we know of to create electricity. So we have to figure out, well, what are the best approaches to create this new electricity that we as a race are going to demand. And so if you look at our options, coal is terrible. And China is quickly finding out why coal is terrible and how much it costs to produce and all the environmental effects there. Natural gas is a little better, but it's still a fossil fuel you're burning and it's still releasing greenhouse gases and all that. Wind and solar are great, now that they also have their potential downsides too with rare earth metals. And, we might not see all the consequences here, but somebody mining rare earths for windmills or something in China might see the downsides that we don't see here. But relatively, they're nice, but they take a lot of land. They're only available in certain areas. They're expensive. They're expensive too. So I think this is where I see the cost, the benefit risk analysis of nuclear. I think this is where it shows up, where nuclear essentially no greenhouse gases, lower than solar, essentially on par with wind if you look at the life cycle. So concerned about global warming, that's a way to address it there. It's compact. It doesn't take up huge amounts of land like potentially wind or solar can. It's constant base load power, which is really different than a lot of our renewables out there. Especially, there's been a lot of wind and solar plants built in the U.S. in the past couple of years, but almost all of them, you get a gas plant built with it. And the reason for that is because, well, when the wind's blowing or the sun's out, you're using the plant, but when it's not, then you switch over to a natural gas turbine instead. So yeah, they'll say, okay, well, this is a base load plant, but really because it's a mix of whatever renewable and gas, and that's what's providing the constant energy. Where nuclear, 100% power, you know what you're getting from 24 hours a day, all year long. Also, it's available anywhere. You put nuclear anywhere. It doesn't matter where wind is, where solar is, or coal resources or natural gas or something like that.
Well, you want to put it somewhere geologically stable.
Yeah.
Water too, doesn't it?
It depends on how you're cooling it. There are nuclear plants in the desert that use different cooling techniques, dry cooling, rather than the big cooling towers. Those kind of rows and rows and rows of fans that they have splayed out to the desert. But I think, and then the last aspect is safety. And essentially, the lives lost because of this electricity source. I mean, we know the lives lost due to coal are probably high. It's tough to tell for sure because it's tough to say, well, how many people die from coal pollution? I know people estimate, thousands a year die from coal pollution, but it's hard to pinpoint it. And even natural gas, you're polluting too, and whatever consequences there are from that pollution. Now, so you have, coal and natural gas are the big guys, and then pretty much all your renewables and nuclear are way down here. I mean, it's funny, the little things that can get you, something like solar. Okay, put a solar panel on people's roofs, and then suddenly they have to climb on a ladder and go on their roof to clean it off if it snows or something else happens. People fall off ladders and die, and suddenly, it's just weird risks like that can pop up with any technology. But I think essentially you see, solar, wind, and nuclear are actually, the lives lost per gigawatt or megawatt hour generator are very comparable. And we've really seen worst case nuclear accidents. I see. I mean, Chernobyl was a terrible accident because it was a poorly designed reactor, no containment. The reactor itself was poorly designed. The operators were doing a poor test when it went up. I mean, it was worst case meltdown with a steam explosion that threw stuff in the air. You had a poor government that was embarrassed and didn't want to evacuate people and threw people into high radiation zones. And I mean, that's a really messy scenario. And the lives lost, so 56 people died immediately from radiation exposure. And the estimates of people who potentially die from cancer from the dose are all over the place. So I'll go off on a little bit of a tangent here, trying to determine
But
dose and
can
cancer
you remind
rates.
us how much time it takes for the area around Chernobyl to how long it takes for that to be cultivated again so that people can live there again? And Fukushima too.
People live around Chernobyl now. The radiation dose, it might be 2 or 3 times what we have here, but I mean it's similar to living in Denver or something like that. There were people who never evacuated in the first place from Zone 2. Now, I will say, trying to determine latent cancer causing radiation is very difficult because this is a morbid statistic, but as a risk analyst, this is the kind of stuff I look into. About 50% of people will get cancer in their lifetime. And that's because we're living longer, we're not dying of other things, so we tend to get cancer a lot now. So about 50% of people get cancer, and about 1 in 4 people die of cancer in their life. So trying to determine the effects of say Chernobyl on the surrounding population becomes muddy. Now some things are very clear, like thyroid cancer in children was a big one post Chernobyl. Luckily, thyroid cancer is a fairly treatable cancer compared to lots of others. So you didn't see a huge amounts of deaths, but you saw a lot of kids with cancer. It was a very bad thing, and I don't want to downplay that. And I think what you've seen, the Chernobyl reactor is just a bad reactor, bad situation, worst case scenario there. Now the Fukushima reactors are much more similar to our operating reactors here, and I think that's worst case scenario there. We have multiple reactors melting down at a single location with no accessibility to backup power and things like that, which is what really caused the accident. So the reactors at Fukushima shut down when the earthquake happened. They automatically do, and that was fine. The problem was, they still produced heat after they shut down, and they lost on-site power, so they switched to their diesel generators, but the tsunami came, wiped out the diesel generators, and they couldn't supply emergency cooling water. And this is stuff we're trying to address in advanced plants where you can provide cooling passively with no power, so no matter what the scenario, even if you lost electricity for a week, or potentially longer, you're cooled by natural circulation and things like that.
Maybe I missed the answer. So how many years would it take in Japan for people to? There are some individuals who go inside and want to be close to their homes. But imagine you have this kind of situation in the United States. How many years would the U.S. government recommend to isolate that area? Is it 50 years, 100 years?
So what I've heard right now in the Fukushima isolation zone, the highest dose areas are roughly like 2 grams per year are the highest dose areas of the zone. Now, how long it would take for that radiation to decay depends on the elements that were dispersed and their half-lives. I don't know that information off the top of my head. The one a lot of people are concerned about is if a little bit of plutonium came out contaminated to the land. The plutonium isn't necessarily a huge health risk, but if you're farming the land and living there, a little bit of plutonium takes a long time to decay, so you can lose a lot of land for a long time because of it. And actually, truthfully, that's what I think the big consequence of nuclear reactor accidents is not the immediate health effect or anything like that, or even potentially the cancer effect. It's loss of land. There's the economic impact like we've seen in Japan is really the big one. And it takes a lot of radiation to hurt you, but a little radiation on land, and suddenly you don't want to use that land anymore. So I think that's the big consequence of say, Fukushima.
Could you give us an example of some of your risk equations? You talk about, let's say, if we're in a car, you want to assess risk, you say death per mile, whatever it is. What's your numerator and denominator when you're working with risk in this business?
There's two the Nuclear Regulatory Commission requires. There's a prompt off-site fatality, and this is straight out of the regulations. Completely honest here, not trying to sugarcoat anything. Right? Yeah, this is right out of the regulation. There's a prompt fatality goal that you have to meet, the likelihood of somebody dying due to radiation next to the plant. And then there's a latent cancer fatality goal that you have to miss, that you have to make sure you're under. These goals say that the probability of somebody dying next to a nuclear power plant has to be lower than 0.01% of the risk from all other energy sources put together. It's how it came up. And that was a completely postulated, made-up value, just as a metric that nuclear plants had
Are these
to.
workable or effective ratios, or are they just government slack?
No, I mean, so what I do is something called probabilistic risk analysis. We have to go through every possible fault scenario in the plant, come up with the likelihood of that fault scenario occurring and the consequence of it. If the consequence of that scenario leads to core melting, we have to say, well, what radionuclides get out? How would they move through the plant? How would they move off-site in different weather conditions? What's the population zone who would be affected? And we have to try to figure out, okay, well, what would be the probability of people dying or getting cancer in the vicinity of the plant? We go through every single possible scenario in the plant. And I mean, now, these things are, a probabilistic risk assessment is gigantic. One for an operating reactor now would probably take 7 or 8 full binders of 1,000 pages each.
Where do you get your data from? Does every nuclear plant in the country have to provide you with data?
They all keep track of
You do
the valve X, we've been running this valve for 10 years. It's failed twice in 10 years. You take the average of all the valves of that type in every nuclear plant in the country, and you come up with the
So
reliability.
you do a big meta-analysis of all of it.
Yeah, that's it. And now let me say, we put numbers to it, but the numbers aren't really what's important. What's important is that you've systematically walked through possible scenarios to try to identify weak points in your plan. That's the real goal of the risk analysis. So if we say, well, in this scenario, we only have one system that kept us from core damage. This shouldn't be. We need another system here to address this need. Or, hey, look, if we lose electrical power, that takes out all of these systems, and we don't want. That's a bad scenario. So we have to figure out a way to address common cause failures too. So that is exactly what we do. And now, lately, what I've been working on is trying to take some of those lessons and take them to the offshore oil and gas industry, because very, very similar to the nuclear industry post 3 Mile Island, the oil industry is going through that same pain now post the BP incident, where before 3 Mile Island, the nuclear utilities really didn't talk to each other much because of competitive advantage and things like that. But 3 Mile Island, the accident that caused 3 Mile Island, which was a stuck pressure relief valve, that same thing happened at another plant a couple months earlier, but they had caught it early and there was no accident. But since they didn't share information, the one in Pennsylvania didn't know that. And so the industry learned from 3 Mile Island that we have to share information on safety, and they created different organizations like IMPO to do this. And now offshore oil and gas industries suffering that same pain where they did not share reliability information, risk information, and now post the BP oil spill, they learned we have to. Because one event affects us all. That the nuclear industry learned that, now the offshore oil and gas industry.
So how come the Japanese risk evaluators allow them to put that on the East Coast where you know tsunami?
Yes.
No.
So there's been a lot of debate about, well, how did they come up with their tsunami numbers? Because you do have, especially there in Japan, you have design basis earthquakes, you have design basis tsunamis, that the plant must survive, X. And what it looks like, there's a bit of controversy here, and I'll explain why in a second. So they started their analysis saying, hey, 1 in a 1,000, 1 in a 10,000 year earthquake, or tsunami, whatever it was, they built a seawall, and the seawall protected them from their assessment of what a 1 in 1,000 year tsunami or something would be. Now, what's suspicious with that, and why the Japanese have come under criticism for this, if you look at the Fukushima power plant, there were 6 reactors. There were the 4 that were affected by the tsunami. They were down here. They built two reactors later at a higher elevation, which were not affected by the tsunami. Which makes you wonder, what did they learn between the time they built those first 4 and the time they built their second 2, that they decided to build their second 2 higher than those first 4. Now luckily, one of those 4 was shut down during the tsunami, so that it didn't melt down. But the other 3 melted down because they were affected by the tsunami. So there's been criticism there. I don't know if it was a cultural thing. Let me say that's the U.S. plants, especially post 9/11, have flex equipment on site, is what we call it, where even if your dedicated backup diesel generators get taken out for some reason, say a flood or even a terrorist attack was the motivation of them doing.
Or tornado. Or tornado.
Or tornado, something like that. That at another location, very close, you have multiple supplies of diesel generators and equipment and trucks and people that you can install stuff and get stuff ready to go quickly. And this was identified post 9/11, and all the plants have adapted this flexible policy now. Fukushima didn't have this; they just had their dedicated diesel generators on site and the backup batteries. Well, the flight took out their diesel generators, but they still had their backup batteries. They ran out to the parking lot, stole more batteries from cars, and lasted as long as they could on that energy. But at some point, the electricity ran out. Now, that's because they have active emergency core cooling systems. Active, I mean that they needed electrical power to run. This is not the way we're trying to design plants now. And the ones being built in the south right now do not need active power to provide emergency core cooling. They use natural circulation of air and water to cool the plant in such a situation.
I need to say that we're at our typical time. I would like for you to talk about the safe new designs, which it sounds like you're getting into, but formally, maybe give a 30-second break if people need to leave. I understand that we're at our official end, but if you want to keep talking.
If you have to.
So if you want to stay, you can keep going.
Yeah, I'm happy to stay as long as anyone has questions.
Keep going.
Careful.
No, and I was talking to Scott and Shallow earlier. I was very excited to come talk to this crowd because, preaching to the choir is no fun. It's not talking to people who are in nuclear energy or something like that. I find this type of interaction and questions from skeptics, which I think is good, much more fun and rewarding and more informative. You and then.
William Langeweiss wrote an article in the Atlantic magazine some time back, and the thesis of his article was that basically we have got to the point where what we create are so system complex that it may actually be impossible to really cover every iota of things that could possibly go wrong with a complex system. And we're going to have to sacrifice the fact that we cannot really manage risk completely if we want to have certain things like an airplane flying through the air or a nuclear power plant. Have you guys discussed this fact?
We haven't actually. That's part of the motivation of going to passive emergency systems is say, well, if you have a passive system, we don't want any valves, we don't want any dampers that have to open, we don't want any human action.
No pumps.
No pumps, no electricity. We want the system to
no power. How are you going to get this?
Well, no. So what you do is you take advantage of natural phenomena like natural circulation is the big one we take advantage of. Where when you heat up air or water, the density becomes less and it rises. Well, then if you cool it, it becomes heavy and it falls again. So if you set up your systems and piping in a certain way, as it goes through the reactor, it will heat up, it will rise. If you have some way of it exchanging heat to the environment, just by passing through a heat exchanger with air, just outside the plant, it will cool, fall back in, recycle to the reactor that way. So that's the type of phenomena that we've been building, using basic physics rather than engineered safety system where, okay, you need batteries and pumps and valves and humans need to do stuff to cool the plants, where just take advantage of natural phenomena that occur. And that's actually, Argonne designed a fast breeder reactor, one of these reactors that creates new fuel called EBR2, built out in Idaho. And one of the interesting things about EBR2 was, so in a normal reactor, when you want to shut down the reactor, you insert control rods. The control rods absorb neutrons and shut down the reaction. Well, Argonne wanted to build a reactor where, well, what happens if you fail to insert your control rods? What if there's a huge earthquake and the control rods don't go in? What they did was they built a reactor that used metal fuel, where if, say, an accident happens and the core starts to heat up, the fuel, because it's metal and metal expands, the fuel rods expand. Because they expand, the core actually grows in size a little bit because of that, it shuts down the chain reaction because now the fuel is too far away from each other to sustain itself. So what they essentially designed an inherent feedback that was able to shut down the reactor in case your control rods didn't work. And then this was one of the benefits of EBR2, and this was a proposed reactor designed by Argonne and by General Electric. Actually, we're working with General Electric right now. They're proposing this reactor design in the UK. The UK has a ton of extra plutonium from their weapons program that they want to get rid of. And they're not sure how to do it. So one of the options is GE, General Electric Hitachi, is proposing to build one of these fast reactors to dispose of it. So right now, we just started a project last week with GE Hitachi to do a risk assessment of this new reactor design. And it leverages this metal fuel design as an inherent reactivity feedback mechanism. So it has that inherent reactivity to shut down the reactor, and then it uses natural circulation for emergency cooling.
Could you say something about accelerator-driven subcritical reactors?
What was that?
Accelerator-driven systems, subcritical reactors.
That's pushing my knowledge of physics.
What was the question?
About accelerator-driven subcritical reactors. So whether you're sustaining the chain reaction not because you're creating enough neutrons, but because of the particle you're accelerating into it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a few words.
Sure, yeah.
It sounds too good to be true away, but it's some way off and high. You can burn up nuclear waste, take a beam, accelerate it into it, and it burns up the waste as well as generating electricity. India is working on this. They've got a thorium, which is I use that for that. I understand we're not doing much in the US at all about it, but it's a sort of reactor. If you pull the plug out, it stops. I mean, it's subcritical, so it will not, it cannot go critical and go on, but you pull the plug out and it stops. So that's about all I know about it, actually.
Yeah, I don't know much about this system.
So it uses the electricity from the reactor to run a particle accelerator that decomposes the waste?
Yeah, look more into it. I don't know much about it off the top of my head. Oh, although you did mention another good point that I should mention. There's been a lot of discussion about thorium reactors rather than uranium reactors. So thorium is like uranium. However, it doesn't have that uranium-235 type atom naturally. So you can't just dig up thorium out of the ground and enrich it or something. There's no enrichment you can do. But what you can do is put it in a breeder reactor, and it will convert that thorium to uranium-233, which is like uranium-235. So you could breed a fissile uranium using thorium, and essentially you could create another closed cycle using thorium rather than natural uranium. We haven't done a lot with it here in the U.S. because we have a lot of uranium accessible to us, especially in Canada. There's a lot of uranium. But say India does not have much uranium, but they have a ton of thorium. So they've been doing a lot of research into using a thorium cycle instead. So China, this was another topic I wanted to mention because China's looking into thorium too. But so just on a grander scale, China is realizing very quickly that building coal plants is very bad, polluting the crap out of their country. But they still need a lot of electricity. So that recently they've become very dedicated to nuclear. They have about 23 reactors operating now. They have about another 25 under construction, about another 30 planned, and then potentially another 150 proposed to be built. So they are very much pursuing the nuclear option as essentially, really their only option to provide a lot of power and without polluting themselves terribly. They just can't meet the energy goals they need using renewables. So the options are either fossil fuels or nuclear. So they're pursuing nuclear. Now, they're building all types of different reactors. They're building breeder reactors, high-temperature gas reactors, because they want to go on a closed fuel cycle very quickly in their country. They don't want to be like the U.S. on this open fuel cycle. They want to reprocess, have breeder reactors, and operate that way. And I think by 2050, they really want to become almost completely on this closed fuel cycle by building breeder reactors. So they are building like gangbusters over there. It kind of reminds me of the U.S. in the 1950s and 1960s, building tons of reactors. I don't know, just talking, we have colleagues who work with China on some of these reactor designs, and just the number of engineers they're cranking out just to do this is almost mind-boggling to us here. You'll go to one of their research centers, and they'll just have thousands of nuclear engineer PhDs just cranking away day after day on these designs. Good.
Do you happen to know if their prototypical designs are safe vis-a-vis Russia or something?
Yeah, so originally they did do some Russian designs, which I'm not the biggest fan of. Lately, what they did was, so this kind of, from my understanding, this kind of bit Westinghouse in the butt a little bit. So Westinghouse has an advanced reactor design called AP1000, which is one of these passively safe type plants. So that China said, okay, well, we want to build some here, so Westinghouse helped China build some of them. And then China decided, oh, well, we don't need you anymore. Now we have the Chinese AP1000. And now they want to sell it abroad instead of. So not only is China building in-house, they want to become an exporter of reactor technology. This is somewhat similar to the U.S. In the 1950s and 60s. The U.S. had a program called Atoms for Peace, where we wanted to promote the peaceful use of nuclear energy as a way to get countries to essentially pair with us rather than pairing with the Soviet Union, because who knows, what the Soviet Union would have done with their nuclear power. So we exported our water reactor technology to a lot of different countries under this Atoms for Peace. Now we didn't sell the way China's hoping to sell technologies and to sell their manufacturing. We just gave away essentially the knowledge and the know-how. So that's why a lot of the countries, let's say in Europe and stuff, use water reactors just like here in the U.S. because it all came out of this Atoms for Peace initiative way back in the day.
I have a question. The water that's used for cooling,
Yes.
does that become contaminated?
So it does become slightly radioactive, and that's actually an important point. I'm glad you mentioned it. There are multiple water loops in our operating plants to separate the radioactivity from the environment. So you have, I'll take a pressurized water reactor, we call it PWR, which is one of the more common designs in the US. You have water that goes through the reactor and heats up, and it stays in a loop. It's the same water going through it again and again and again. That water, through a steam generator, heats another loop of water that creates steam. That steam loop is what powers your turbine. So that way your radioactive water isn't touching your turbine and stuff like that, because it can make your turbine radioactive and you don't want that. So that way your more radioactive water is contained in this initial loop. And then that water you see in a cooling tower, that is water that's cooling the condenser of the secondary loop. So that's even another loop removed from this radioactive water in plants, either the third or in some plants even the fourth loop of water removed. So yeah, that primary water that's going through the reactor does become radioactive. There's a tritium gets created from the hydrogen in the water, and just if some of the fuel, every once in a while you might have a fuel pin fail just because you have hundreds of them, and structurally one might fail. You might get some fission products in the water too, but I don't want to say that this water is so dangerous if you walk by it, you die. I've been in plenty of plants walking right by these water lines. The radiation dose isn't crazy, but it's radioactive enough you don't want it touching your turbine or and stuff like that. And I will say, just because we have so many nuclear plants nearby, you can go visit nuclear plants, no problem. I should say, as long as you're a U.S. citizen. If you're not a U.S. citizen, it becomes a little more complicated. which is something we run into a lot at Argonne. About only half our staff is born in the U.S. We get engineers from all over the world. But say Clinton Power Plant I've been at, it's downstate a little bit. It's our only one that's only one reactor in this state. It was supposed to be two, but the financials didn't work out by the time they finished to build the second unit. But Clinton's a real interesting reactor to go on a tour of. And it's funny because that reactor design, you could actually even go on inside containment while it's operating on a tour. You can go and stand right next to the vessel creating energy while it's operating inside containment, which is, I think, really interesting. You get to wear a little radiation dosimeter too, just to make sure you're not getting in the switch. Actually, so real quick funny story. In grad school, I had a friend who in his spare time apparently likes to collect uranium and go uranium mining and things like that. Well, anytime you go in and out of a nuclear power plant, you go through scanners to check for radioactivity, just to make sure you weren't accidentally exposed or maybe you're trying to sneak something out or whatever. Well, he set off the alarm. Not because of anything in the plant, but because apparently he was wearing the pants he was mining uranium or something. So he had to strip down, leave his clothes there, and they gave him a gown to wear home. Along a similar note, I always think this story is good. So coal plants actually put out a surprising amount of radiation, because you're digging up coal from the ground, there's uranium mixed in there too, and you burn it and throw it up into the air. And especially if you go by the piles of the excess, what's the
petrol?
slag? The slag. There's some dose coming off of these. So for some utilities, the utility owns nuclear plants, they own coal plants, they own whatever. So there was the one guy I was talking to, they were who worked at a nuclear power plant, they like to hold their meeting at the coal power plant. He said because when the meeting was done, we'd go walk around, the slag fields and stuff for a while with our dosimeters on. We get back to the plant, we've exceeded our daily dose. So we but working at the coal plant don't check their dose. The same with an airline stewardess. Yeah. She doesn't record her dose, but her doses might be somewhat comparable to a nuclear power plant worker being at high elevation all the time.
I've heard an ad on radio for support of legislation in Illinois. Call your legislators. You don't want to endanger nuclear power in Illinois.
Yeah.
What is the legislation?
So that's, I don't know all the specifics of the legislation, but I can talk about the issue more in general because it's really messy. So depending on what state you are in, electricity rates are set different ways, whether market rates or government set or board rates or things like that. And what has happened is that with wind and solar coming on board and with the credits they receive through government incentives, when they're producing power, they can essentially produce power and put it to the grid at zero cost because of credits and other needs. And what is happening, and I've heard this happening in Illinois, I don't know all the specifics of our pricing structure in Illinois, so I can't get into all of it, but that the dumping the electricity to the grid is so cheap that, a nuclear power plant, you don't want to turn it on and off every day. You want to run 18 months at a time, full power, producing 100% power. But what's happening is when the wind or solar is putting power on the grid, it drives the rate so low that the nuclear plants are taking a huge loss during that time. And like I was telling some of the guys before here, they could lose $1 million a day if the power rates sink to zero or close to it. But the problem is that the wind and solar aren't constant on the grid. So there's a danger that because of these low rates, a couple of the plants in Illinois, especially like Clinton, where it's only one reactor at a site, so they're still paying for all the security and everything, even though they only have one reactor there. They're losing millions of dollars at the plant because of this. So Exelon, who runs the plants, is thinking about shutting them down because they're just losing way too much money. But then the problem becomes that for us as a state, we lose base load electricity generation because of the intermittent electricity generation of wind and solar, which, right now, the capacity of our nuclear plants in Illinois produce, I think, a little over 10,000 megawatts. I think even if the wind plants that we built recently were producing 100% capacity, which is really rare, it's only something like 2,000 megawatts, which usually wind plants operate on an average at like 30% capacity. So it's more like 500 or 600 megawatts is coming from wind in the state, and over 10,000 megawatts is coming from nuclear. But that little bit of wind being able to put power out the grid at zero really messes with the economics of these base load plants, where if you have a natural gas plant, if the rate goes to zero, you turn it off because you don't want to lose money, and then when the rate comes back up, you turn it back on again. And this actually became a problem during the big polar vortex, not this winter, but last winter, where natural gas prices around Chicago became very expensive because the natural gas pipelines had started to freeze because the temperatures were so cold. Well, the natural gas power plants around here didn't want to lose money because natural gas cost too much, so they just shut down. And actually, Chicago was very close to experiencing brownouts in the middle of the polar vortex because the gas plants shut down. It was only because of the nuclear capacity. It's funny that the efficiency of nuclear actually went up over 100% during the polar vortex because the cold temperatures helps their condensers, things like that. So luckily that we had the nuclear plants still working at 100%, or Chicago would have been in a bit of trouble with our electricity because the gas plants didn't want to operate at a loss, so they just turned off. And so we were a little too uncomfortably close to brownouts. In the middle of winter during the coldest time. I can't say I'm pro or con on the bill because I don't know the specifics and how they're messing with pricing. So what they want to do is somehow credit nuclear for A, releasing no greenhouse gases, and B, being baseload energy supply rather than intermittent wind and solar. Where they're saying, well, wind and solar are getting these credits, they can produce power at zero cost, but they're only intermittent. We should get some credit for saying we're on 24 hours a day, always at the same rate. We need to somehow adjust the pricing structure to take account for that, because we don't want to push out our baseload supply and just have wind and solar and potentially natural gas might shut down depending on the pricing structure of natural gas. So there's various ways people have proposed of doing that. A carbon tax has been one way. So I don't know the specifics of how they're thinking about it, but something along those lines is what they're thinking. And it's a real tricky situation. There's a Vermont Yankee shut down because of up in New Hampshire. Or is it Vermont? It's really close to the line. Shut down because of a similar problem.
Okay.
The pricing structure for that just wasn't working out, and there was.
What do you do as far as increasing power when there's an increased power demand? Do you draw the graphite rods further out?
So
in
nuclear
a coal fire, they just put more coal, they put more gas.
Nuclear plants are almost always operating 100% because they are base load. So our energy use through the day, goes up and down with night and day. But there's still, this chunk that we're always using, and that's nuclear's in that chunk down there. It's not part of this cyclical energy sources like natural gas plants will cycle on and off during the night and day to account for these.
You're always going full blast?
Even
though there's not a demand for full blast?
Well, the thing is that there's always a demand for full blast. There's always a demand for 100% power. The problem they're running into is that the price on the grid, say if one wind plant comes online, they're dumping power at zero, so the price for power goes to zero for everybody. And then it's different pricing structures in different parts of the countries handle this in different ways.
I'm skeptical about some of the things you're saying, because I've read other articles on the pricing structure, because you're talking the spot market. And usually nuclear doesn't operate in the spot market, just because of what you're saying. They got to have their stuff sold a day in advance, because they know they're producing it, where the wind and solar, they operate in the spot market. The other thing is, I'll have to go back and verify, but according to the article, nuclear is getting subsidized at like a nickel a kilowatt hour.
I say it depends. I don't know.
Because they were saying that they, in the bad, UR times, that they can actually go negative on the market, so they can sell for a -2. Because like you said, they can't shut down.
Yeah, I have to know more about
So all
that.
I'm saying is, when you're talking about wind and solar, they definitely deal with the spot market, but typically your nuclear plant, you're not operating in the spot market. Because you can't, you're a day in advance, you have to know what you got to do.
Yeah.
So I want to thank Dr. Grabaskas. We can sit